Dan Weintraub here, the Angry Moderate. I did this show before I went to Oklahoma City for a job for a year, and now I have returned. And CATV is allowing me to do this. And you can do it too, by the way. You can come down to community access television and prattle away about all kinds of minutia or all kinds of stuff that very few people really want to listen to. And they will film it. They will film it and put it on television. Extraordinary. I feel like Wayne Campbell. Wayne's World. Party on. Excellent. Remember when he does this? Camera one, camera two, camera one, camera two. Love that. Anyway, the Angry Moderate Show is an hour-long or so show where I talk about different political and economic issues, and most people scan right by it and go to ESPN to watch the college football game or go to HBO to watch some special or some funky movie that's rated R and that they wouldn't be able to get on regular TV like when we were growing up. I'm almost 50 years old, and of course when you and I, the 50-plus generation, were watching TV, there were like 5 channels, right? There was I grew up in Boston, Channel 4, Channel 5, Channel 7, and then, of course, the UHF stations, Channel 38 and Channel 56. And then there was like Channel 68, which came out of nowhere. And I remember they showed Tales from the Dark Side, which was a really terrible and wonderful show. But now, of course, you can have hundreds of channels on your cable TV or your satellite TV, but that's neither here nor there. But, of course, CATV is on cable TV. And that makes me able to come up here and babble like this, and for you to think, why the heck am I watching this? I'm going to go watch somebody on the Weather Channel, like Dave Schwartz, who, by the way, got fired from the Weather Channel. And Dave Schwartz once said the most amazing thing. I was in a hotel room. A friend of mine and I were storm chasing. Not kidding. We were hanging out in Dodge City, Kansas, and Dave Schwartz came on the Weather Channel and he said, "Now we're entering spring, the season that links fall and summer." And we both looked at each other and said, yeah, this guy should probably get fired, because if you don't know that spring is the season that links winter and summer, then, I said fall and summer, see, then you shouldn't be really going to school, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so this is all right. I got to talk about the economy and I got to talk about politics, because otherwise, waste of time. Anyway, the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to read from the Valley News, or as someone I know says, our LDN, local daily newspaper. And it's a letter from a gentleman named Kurt Peterson, who talks about mortgaging Social Security. And I would like to refute his argument with great vehemence and great vigor, though I'll try to do it moderately without, see, the show used to be called The Angry Moderate, but I'm not as angry anymore. In the last couple of years, I has really smoothed the edges. Been a long couple of years, and so the anger has waned, much more centered these days, not quite as angry. And so also probably even more moderate. Anyway, Kurt Peterson says, to the editor, "The euphemistic phrase payroll taxes rolls off the political tongues as if it's some arbitrary levy that can be reduced at will to relieve pressure on the economy. Let's be clear, the payroll tax, otherwise known as FICA, or Federal Insurance Contributions Act tax, is actually the contribution made equally every year by employers and employees to support Social Security benefits paid to beneficiaries during the contributing year. When the tax was 15%, employees and employers each paid half of the tax, yada, yada, yada." In President Obama's speech to a joint session of Congress, September 8th, he spoke of, quote, "continuing the reduction of the payroll tax for both employees and employers. Republicans would like to limit the contribution for employers only, discontinuing the reduction for employees when it expires." And now Peterson gets to his main point. Mr. Peterson. "In reality, this is nothing more than a loan extension that makes no long-term sense whatsoever. Ultimately, we will have 2 choices. 1, increase FICA contributions to pay back today's deficit," which we don't have to do. We don't have to do that. Remember that. Remember that. The deficit is not something that we have to somehow mortgage our futures and pay back. But hold that thought there. And 2, reduce Social Security benefits to make up the deficit. Don't have to do it. No, hold on. Social Security is a put in and take out system. If we take today, we have to put in or take less tomorrow. Mr. Peterson and many of those who fall into the same camp politically as Mr. Peterson do not understand modern money. They are conflating monetary issues with political issues. Now, Mr. Peterson says here that we will have to increase FICA contributions to pay back today's deficit. It's not true. In a fiat currency system, in a system of floating exchange rates, and in a system in which our currency cannot be redeemed for anything other than other pieces of currency, there are no operational limits to the amount of money that banks can create with the permission of the federal government, with a nod from the federal government. There are no limits to the amount of money, operationally speaking. I'm not talking about the impact. I'm talking about the actual operational considerations, accounting truths, that can be created by the banks with a nod from the federal government. Think of it this way. This is a description that's used by a man named Warren Mosler, who is a proponent of something called MMT, or Modern Monetary Theory, which is kind of a post-Keynesian view of money. So think about it this way. There's a train outside right now. I can hear the train. Because I'm in the Tip Top building in White River Junction. So if you want to be on CATV, just come down to you can get great coffee at the Tip Top at the cafe, or at the what's it called there? The something box, Flutter box, Kettle box, something. Tucker box. And you can come do shows like this where you can babble on about stuff that very few people maybe have interest in. In any event, back to my point about Mr. Peterson and about money. Mr. Peterson's argument that somehow this is a zero-sum game would only be true if we were still under something called a gold standard, or if money was tied to some commodity. So prior to 1971, money as we know it, dollars, were tied to gold. And so the idea that you could spend more money than you had or rack up more debts than you had was problematic, because at some point somebody might, say, hey, look, we don't trust that you actually have the actual money to pay us back for the things that you're borrowing, and so we don't want your dollars anymore. We want our gold. We're going to trade in our dollars for gold, please. We don't trust these things called Federal Reserve notes anymore. But in 1971, Richard Nixon, I believe it was Milton Friedman who gave him this advice. Richard Nixon defaulted on our gold obligations and said to the rest of the world, we are no longer tying, because actually Nixon, when he was in private, spoke in a Spanish accent, we are no longer going to tie the dollar to the gold anymore. We are just going to have the dollar be irredeemable. That wasn't I'm not sure that wasn't a great accent. Now, why Nixon was doing this was because it was 1971. There had been something called the Vietnam War that needed to be paid for. There had been a lot of spending that had taken place, many would argue, during the Lyndon Johnson years with regard to all of the social programs that were growing up out of the movements, the peace movements and the social movements of the 1960s. And so there was a lot to spend on, but there were limits to the amount of money that could be created. When you have an irredeemable currency, when it is a pure fiat currency, there are no operational limits. Look, back to Warren Mosler. He makes this analogy, and it's true. Operationally, it's true. When you are at a football game, if you go to the Dartmouth football game, and Dartmouth scores a touchdown, and 6 points are put onto the scoreboard, there are no limits to the amount of points that can be put on the scoreboard. It's not like you get to a certain point and no more numbers could be put on the scoreboard. This is the same thing with dollars. All that happens when money is created is that the Federal Reserve adds or takes money out of reserve accounts in computer accounts in the Federal Reserve. All that happens when the Treasury Department is lent $5 billion or $10 billion by the Federal Reserve. By the way, understand this, the Federal Reserve, even though it has the name Federal Reserve Bank, is not part of the U.S. government. They are independent entities. Yes, Ben Bernanke has to occasionally go before Congress and explain himself, but they are independent entities. The Federal Reserve is a private institution with some governmental ties because it is the central bank of the United States, but it is not the Bank of the United States. It's not controlled by the United States government. You should know that because, of course, Ben Bernanke is always saying, we don't want to have our monetary policies tied to political issues. But I'm going to get back to why Mr. Peterson is conflating, mixing up political issues with monetary ones, because Social Security is a political thing. It's not a monetary thing. So in a fiat currency system, there are no limits to the amount of money that the Federal Reserve can create. It could go, Ben Bernanke could literally go into the Federal Reserve offices tomorrow, go to a bunch of computers and add $1 quadrillion to reserve accounts at the Federal Reserve. All it is, it would take turning on the computer, hitting a few keys, and hitting enter. There are no constraints vis-a-vis something called gold or any other commodity to doing that. You do know how money is created, right, in the United States. Do you not know that? Wow, so listen, this is really important to understand how money is created in the United States. Money is created not by the federal government. Understand that. A lot of people think, oh yes, they do. A lot of dollars are printed by the U.S. mints, and that's how money is created. No, money is created by banks when they loan. That's what loan. And let me put in parentheses, that's why you always hear people in government saying we need the credit markets to get loosened. We need there to be money to be lent. Now, the federal government lends money, but it has to borrow that money first. Banks create money by lending money to people who promise to repay it with interest. If you go, let's say that you want to buy a 1978 Camaro, and that 1978 Camaro green T-top, I don't know anything about cars, but I'm going to make something up here. 454, 6 under the floor with the overhead cam, and I don't know what I'm talking about. If you want to buy that car for $10,000, it's a used car, and you go to the bank and you say to the bank, hey, I'd like to buy this, 78 Camaro, the green one with the T-top and the 454 with the cam and the 7 under the hood, and I don't know. Will you lend me the $10,000 to do that? And the bank supposedly, the bank is supposed to look over and say, well, you've got a good job and you make this much money a month, and yeah, we'll lend you the money. Obviously, over the last 20 years, banks haven't done that so much because they've known deep down that either A, the government would bail them out if they made bad loans, or B, they can package those loans into these things called securities and sell them off to other people and be like, oh, we don't have anything to worry about. We made our commission. So, banks, when they loan money, that money is digitally credited to your account. So if you go to the bank and you borrow $10,000 to buy a car, what happens? All of a sudden your checking account or savings account is bigger by $10,000. Magical. And all the bank officer does is hit a few computer keys and hit the enter key, and into Dan Weintraub's account goes $10,000. And of course, Dan Weintraub, not being very smart nor good with money, says, whoa, I've got $10,000. Well, the truth is that I'm actually in debt $4,500 because the bank has lent me that money predicated upon my promise to repay that $10,000, the principal, with interest. And that's how money is created, in the tens of billions. That's why our government is absolutely addicted to credit. Because without there being credit, without credit being extended, without the ability for credit to be extended, without the ability for people to borrow money, money can't be created. Unless, of course, and this is what I think should happen, but everybody's going to be like, oh, you're a socialist! Oh, you're a Marxist! Which, Marx had some good ideas, but please, relax. I think that the federal government should be in charge of creating money. And the reason the federal government should be in charge of creating money is then all these arguments by people like Kurt Peterson would be absurd. Because everything would be fully funded by definition if the government were in charge of the creation of money. But for hundreds of years now, that has not been the case. Because what's happened is over the several hundred years, banks have become in charge of creating money, and they create money based upon a borrower's promise to repay. And even if that borrower is the federal government. So here's what happens. Back to camera one. Here's what happens. The federal government says, whoa, we need some money. We got to put a few $billions in the treasury because we're kind of running out of money here. And so they decide that they're going to offer treasury notes, right? Bonds, promises to repay somebody with interest for lending them money. The government says, boy, we need $10 billion. We are going to go out there in this thing called the open market, and we're going to offer $10 billion in U.S. bonds at a certain interest rate, yada, yada. And let's say that a bunch of people and countries are like, we're not going to lend the United States government any money. Their credit rating has been shot to heck. Standard & Poor's, la, 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 and they're not going to pay us back. They just keep printing. Well, the Federal Reserve can step in and say, we'll lend you the money. What do they care? So they can print up $5 or $10 billion, enter it into the reserve account of the U.S. government treasury at the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve now has created, out of thin air, $10 billion. And the promise is that the federal government will repay that to the bank with interest. So it probably ends up being about, what, $12, $13 billion as opposed to the initial principal of $10 billion. And then people like Kurt Peterson, Mr. Peterson, says, well, all of that public debt that is being accumulated is going to have to be paid back by the taxpayer. And this is what the Tea Party people say. Tea Party. We'll get to the Tea Party because these people are morons. This is what the Tea Party people say. The Tea Party people and the people on the right say, every time the public accumulates more debt, that debt is going to have to be paid for by future generations. And we look at Greece and we say, see, look at Greece. They borrowed beyond their means and now they're having to go through all of these austerity measures and huge taxes and everybody in Greece is really... But that doesn't have to be us because remember, we have a fiat currency. Our currency is not tied to any commodity. Greece is on the euro system. They can't create their own currency at will. They're kind of stuck, and because they're part of this thing called the Eurozone, they are sort of in a very difficult position. They have to ask the European Union for these things that we call bailouts. The United States government, if it were the issuer of its own money, would never be in a position of having to beg for money from banks and from other countries because there would be no relationship between the money that was being created and the services that that money was being used for. So when Mr. Peterson opines that ultimately we will have two choices, increase FICA contributions to pay back today's deficit, he's making a political point. He's not making a monetary point. He's making a political point that the right wing has somehow convinced us all of, that any time you borrow money as a nation, you're going to have to pay it back with taxes. And those taxes will have to be spread out over, all the different social classes. But the reality is that when these monies are created, there is no relationship between the need to pay them back and the services that they are used to fund. So, have some coffee. So what people need to understand with regard to fiat currency and with regard to US dollars is that the